On a decisive morning, a millionaire businessman was preparing for the most important meeting of his career when the doorbell rang desperately. An 8-year-old girl appeared at the door, carrying his seemingly unconscious and injured 7-year-old son, crying out with a trembling voice, "Uncle, your son was run over." Overcome with absolute despair, he completely abandoned the billion-dollar meeting that would save his company and ran to the hospital. There, he discovered something that shattered his world. The knot of the Italian silk tie seemed tighter than usual, a strange premonition in the oppressive silence of the morning. Arthur Sterling adjusted it for the third time, his reflection in the walk-in closet mirror revealing the impeccable image of a man who commanded an empire. The custom-tailored suit didn't show a single crease. The leather shoes gleamed like polished obsidian. Everything in his life was meticulously controlled. From the stock portfolio he obsessively monitored, to the perfect alignment of the silverware on the dining table where he rarely sat with his son. Today, however, control felt like a fragile illusion. The 10 o'clock meeting wasn't just another deal. It was his lifeline, a billion-dollar investment that would stop his vast fortune from crumbling under the weight of risky decisions. The capital he needed was monumental, and failure was not an option. As he walked down the cold marble corridor, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the mansion, his eyes fixed on a photograph on the wall, Helena, his late wife, smiled at him. Her eyes filled with a light he felt had been extinguished from the world. Beside her, a small Leo, 5 years old at the time, hugged her leg. The memory of Helena's last words hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Promise me, Arthur. Promise me you won't let the money and the business steal you from Leo. He needs a father, not an inheritance," he had promised, and he had been failing miserably every day since. The guilt was a constant shadow, a liability on his emotional balance sheet that no fortune could cover. He turned away, trying to push the memory aside, refocusing on the numbers, the profits, the strategy that would pull him back from the financial abyss. The smell of fresh coffee, brewed by his housekeeper, hung in the air, but he had no time for it. He grabbed his leather briefcase, his mind already rehearsing the arguments, the profitability charts, the cash flow projections he would present. Every second was precious. The difference between salvation and ruin was just hours away. He glanced at his diamond-encrusted wristwatch, a gift he'd given himself after closing a deal that had netted him millions. 10 minutes until departure. Everything was timed, perfect, controlled. That's when the sound ripped through the silence. Not the soft, discreet chime of the doorbell, but a desperate, frantic pounding on the massive oak door. And then another and another, accompanied by a sharp, childish cry. Arthur frowned, irritated. Who would dare disturb his peace in such a way? An unacceptable interruption on such a crucial day. He marched to the door, impatience hardening his features, ready to dismiss whoever it was with a curt command. His hand turned the polished bronze handle, and he pulled the door open, a reprimand already on the tip of his tongue. But the words died in his throat. Before him, small and breathless, was a girl he had never seen before. Her eyes, huge and filled with panic, were fixed on his. And in her thin arms, in a way that seemed impossible, she was holding the limp body of his son, Leo. The boy's head lolled back. His eyes closed, and a smudge of dirt and something that looked far too dark stained his temple. The girl lifted her tear-streaked face to him, her voice trembling in a cry that shattered Arthur's world into a million pieces. "Sir, it's your son." He was hit. For an instant that stretched into an eternity, the air left Arthur's lungs. The world, once an equation of profits and losses, collapsed into a single point of terror. His son's pale face in the arms of a stranger, the leather briefcase containing the documents that were worth his empire, slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor with a dull, distant thud. The sound barely registered. Nothing else mattered. The investment, the meeting, the threat of bankruptcy, it all dissolved into an insignificant fog. He knelt, his trembling hands reaching for Leo, the touch of his cold skin sending a wave of ice through his veins. "Leo, son, talk to me." His voice, accustomed to commanding boardrooms, came out as a hoarse, desperate whisper. The girl, tears still streaming down her dirty face, just stammered, "He wouldn't wake up. We need to get to a hospital. Fast!" Adrenaline took over, a primal instinct he hadn't felt in years, with a strength he didn't know he possessed. Arthur lifted his son's inert body into his arms and rose to his feet. Leo felt so light, so fragile. A wave of guilt devastated him, more powerful than any financial crisis. Helena had warned him. How many nights had he spent at the office? How many weekends had he sacrificed for one more deal, one more digit in his bank account? His entire net worth, all his assets, now seemed like a pile of worthless ashes against the possibility of losing the only treasure that truly mattered. He ran to the garage, not bothering to close the mansion's front door, leaving it wide open. The girl followed, her small feet pattering hastily on the ground to keep up with his long strides. He placed Leo carefully in the back seat of his luxury sedan, the boy's head resting on a velvet cushion. "Get in!" he ordered the girl, who obeyed without hesitation, climbing in beside Leo, her eyes fixed on him. Arthur peeled out of the private driveway, the tires squealing on the asphalt. He drove like a madman, weaving through traffic, ignoring red lights and furious horns. His mind was a whirlwind of pleas and regrets. Please, let him be okay. Please, give me another chance. He glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds. Leo's face remained still, and the girl beside him just watched, a small, silent guardian in the midst of the chaos. He tried to ask her what happened, where, how, but the questions tangled in his throat. All he could do was press harder on the accelerator, the hospital his only beacon of hope in a sea of darkness. The trip that normally took 20 minutes was conquered in less than 10. He screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, leaped out, and threw open the back door. He scooped Leo into his arms again and ran inside, shouting for help. Immediately, nurses and doctors surrounded him. A gurney appeared, and his son was taken from his arms, disappearing through a set of double doors. Arthur tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him with a gentle but firm hand on his arm. "Sir, please wait here. We need you to fill out some forms." He looked down at his hands, now empty and trembling. He felt powerless, stripped of all the control that money had always afforded him. He was just a terrified father in a hospital waiting room. The girl had followed him in and was now huddled in an orange plastic chair, small and lost in the sterile environment. Minutes dragged on like hours, every beep of a machine, every call over the loudspeaker was torture. Finally, a grey-haired doctor with a serious expression walked toward him. Arthur held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, bracing for the worst. The doctor stopped in front of him, his gaze not one of pity, but of sheer confusion. "Mr. Sterling," he began, his voice calm, "can we talk for a moment? There's something we're not understanding about your son. Something we're not understanding." The doctor's words hung in the sterile hospital air, and Arthur's mind, trained to anticipate worst-case business scenarios, projected medical catastrophes with terrifying speed. Undetected internal injury, a subtle neurological trauma. He braced himself for a diagnosis that would change his life forever, a liability no wealth on earth could cover. The doctor, however, continued with a calm that bordered on surreal. "We've done a full evaluation, sir. Scans, neurological exams, everything. Your son is perfectly fine. There isn't a single scratch on him. The dirt on his face was just, dirt. He was in a very deep sleep when he arrived. But he woke up a few minutes ago and asked if he could have breakfast yet." Arthur blinked, processing the information. "Fine. Perfectly fine." The wave of relief that washed over him was so overwhelming, his knees buckled, and he had to lean against the cold wall to keep from collapsing. Leo was safe. The nightmare was over. For one glorious second, that was the only truth. But as the tide recedes to reveal the sharp rocks beneath, relief gave way to an icy confusion. If Leo was fine, then what was all that? The desperate rush, the blind panic, the most important meeting of his career abandoned without a word. All for nothing. A lie. The confusion quickly hardened into a deep, silent fury. He had been played, manipulated in the cruelest way possible, using his single vulnerability, his son. His entire emotional capital had been drained by a sham. Who would do such a thing? And why? His suspicious mind began to spin, imagining scenarios of extortion, of botched kidnappings. That girl, she was the key. "Where is he?" Arthur asked, his voice low and controlled, barely masking the rage simmering beneath. The doctor led him to an ER cubicle. There, sitting on the edge of the gurney and swinging his legs, was Leo, eating a cup of strawberry jello a nurse had given him. Seeing his father, the boy's smile faltered, replaced by a look of guilt. "Dad," he began, his voice small. Arthur moved closer, his face a mask of seriousness. "Leo, what happened? Who is that girl? Why did she say you were hit by a car?" Leo looked down at the jello, poking it with his spoon. "It was just a game, Dad. We were just playing." A game. The word echoed in Arthur's mind with bitter scorn. A game that could have cost him his company, his fortune, everything he had worked his entire life for. This was not a game, Leo. "Where is she?" Leo shrugged, refusing to meet his father's gaze. "I don't know." It was obvious the boy was lying, protecting her. Frustrated, and sensing he would get nothing more from his son at that moment, Arthur turned sharply. He would handle this another way. He would find that girl and demand answers. He marched back to the waiting room, his eyes scanning the area, searching for the small figure huddled in the orange chair. But the spot was empty. The seat she had occupied was now taken by an elderly man reading a newspaper. He approached the reception desk. "The little girl who came in with me, dark hair, simple dress. Where is she?" The receptionist looked up, her expression blank. "I'm sorry, sir. With all the commotion, I didn't see her leave. She was here a moment ago, but then she was gone." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. She couldn't have just disappeared. He looked around, down the hallways, toward the automatic exit. There was no sign of her anywhere. She had vanished, leaving behind a trail of chaos and a question that burned in his mind with alarming intensity. Who was she, and what did she really want? The drive back to the mansion was conducted in a heavy, tense silence. The furious roar of the engine that had once mirrored Arthur's panic now seemed to mock his humiliation. Every red light was a forced pause for his anger and confusion to deepen. Beside him, Leo remained huddled in the passenger seat, his chin on his chest, refusing to speak or look at his father. The boy, who had been the center of his panic, had now become part of a conspiracy he couldn't comprehend. The trust between them, already as fragile as a silk thread, felt as if it had snapped. Arthur wanted to scream, to demand explanations. But he knew Leo's stubbornness was a mirror of his own. Pushing him would only make him shut down further. He needed another approach, a strategy, like in one of his complex business deals. He needed to understand the variables before he acted. Upon arriving, the front door was still wide open, a silent invitation to the chaos that had invaded his orderly life. The leather briefcase lay on the floor, forgotten. He picked it up, the weight of the documents now feeling insignificant. His mind, however, couldn't switch off completely. The meeting. What time was it? He looked at his watch. It was past noon. The opportunity to save his company, the billion-dollar investment, was gone. A sense of loss hit him, but it was different from the terror he'd felt hours earlier. It was a calculable loss, measurable in dollars and cents, not in the beat of a heart. Still, the failure gnawed at him. He had been outmaneuvered, not in a boardroom by a shrewder rival, but by an 8-year-old girl with an absurd story. Inside, he dismissed the housekeeper, who was looking at him with concern, and poured himself a glass of water. His hands still trembling slightly, he sat in his leather armchair in the study, his mind racing. The pathological suspicion Helena had always criticized took control. This was no childish prank. It was too elaborate, too precise. The girl had appeared at the exact moment he was about to leave for the most critical meeting of his career. It was a deliberate distraction, but to what end? He picked up the phone and dialed the number for his head of security. "Harris, I need you. I want you to pull all security camera footage from my street and the surrounding area. I want to know where a little girl, about 8 years old, dark hair, faded blue dress, came from. She was here this morning. I want to know where she went, and I want to know everything about her." As he waited, the image of the girl wouldn't leave his mind. That panic in her eyes. It had seemed so real. Could she have been that talented an actress? Or was there something more, something he wasn't seeing? His son, Leo, knew more than he was saying. He went to the boy's room. Leo was sitting on his bed, building something with Legos, his concentration a barrier against the outside world. Arthur sat beside him, the bed sinking with his weight. "Leo," he said, his voice softer this time. "I'm not angry, just concerned. I need to understand. Do you trust that girl? Is she your friend?" Leo continued to click the blocks together, not looking up. After a long silence, he mumbled almost inaudibly, "Her name is Clara, and she said it was to protect you." Protect him. The word caught him off guard. Protect him from what? From a business meeting. The idea was ludicrous. It sounded more like a childish excuse invented to cover up a prank that went too far. Arthur felt his frustration rising again. He was being made a fool of by 2 children. His cell phone vibrated. It was Harris. "Sir, we have a problem. The footage is strange." She appeared out of nowhere, from an alley with no camera coverage. After she left your property, she went back to the same spot and just vanished. But that's not it. The real issue is what happened at the location of your meeting. Arthur stiffened. "What happened, Harris?" Harris's voice on the other end of the line was grim. "The FBI is there, sir. Multiple squad cars, yellow tape everywhere. It looks like there was a major bust. They've arrested several people." The glass of water in Arthur's hand trembled, and a cold, impossible thought began to form in his mind. What if it wasn't a lie to ruin him, but to save him? Harris's information hit Arthur with the force of a cold wave, dragging away all his anger and replacing it with a deep, unsettling disquiet. The FBI arrests at the exact location where he was supposed to be negotiating the future of his financial empire. The coincidence was too stark to be ignored, a piece that didn't fit the puzzle of betrayal he had been assembling in his mind. What could Clara, a mysterious little girl, and Leo, his complicit son, possibly know about an FBI raid? Leo's phrase echoed in his head. "She said it was to protect you." The idea, once absurd, now took root in his analytical brain. Protect him from what? From the police, from whoever was being arrested. He needed to see for himself. "Stay here, Leo, and don't leave the house," he ordered, his voice firm but without its earlier hardness. He grabbed his car keys again and drove, this time with calculated precision, toward the city's financial district. The address of the investment firm where the meeting was to take place was a towering skyscraper, a symbol of the wealth and power he so desperately sought to solidify. As he approached, the scene confirmed Harris's words. Squad cars blocked the street, their lights flashing in a silent, hypnotic rhythm. Yellow police tape cordoned off the building's entrance, and men in suits, their expressions grim. were being escorted out in handcuffs by federal agents. They were faces he knew, executives, men with whom he had shared tables at expensive restaurants, discussing stocks, crypto, and the cash flow of ambitious projects. Arthur parked at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold from inside his car. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a dawning comprehension that was clearing the fog of his confusion. He hadn't been the victim of a childish prank. He had been the target of something much larger and more dangerous. That meeting wasn't about $1 billion investment to save his business. It was a trap. The girl's charade, his son's supposed accident. It wasn't to stop him from making money. It was to stop him from walking straight into an ambush. He pulled out his phone and searched the local news. The headlines were already popping up. FBI dismantles high-level executive kidnapping ring. The article detailed how a criminal organization had been using the promise of major investments to lure multimillionaires to secluded locations where they would be taken hostage for massive ransoms, paid in gold or Bitcoin to make them untraceable. A chill ran down his spine. His name would have been on that list. His fortune, his assets, made him a perfect target. He pictured the scenario, him walking into that meeting room, expecting to discuss dividends and returns, only to be met by armed men. His life, his freedom, all would have been reduced to a financial transaction, and he never would have seen it coming. His obsession with profit had blinded him to the real danger, and who had saved him? Not his bodyguards, not his state-of-the-art security system, not his network of powerful contacts. A little girl, a child who had somehow learned of the plot and orchestrated a desperate, risky performance to keep him away. The gratitude that flooded him was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by an even stronger feeling: fear. If she knew about this, who else knew that she knew? How did a child gain access to such dangerous information? He had to find her, no longer to demand answers in anger, but to understand, to thank her, and above all, to protect her. Because if she had put herself in the path of such dangerous criminals to save him, she was now in a danger he could barely begin to imagine. He called Harris again, his voice urgent. "Forget what I said before. Change the focus. I don't want to know who she is. I want to know where she is. Use every resource. Find Clara, now." The search for the mysterious girl had transformed from a hunt for vengeance into a desperate race against time. The search for Clara proved more complex than Arthur had imagined. The alley where she had vanished was a blind spot, a maze of narrow lanes in an old, dense neighborhood where Harris's surveillance technology met its limits. For 2 days, Arthur's security team canvassed the area, showing a grainy photo of the girl, captured from a distant camera, to shopkeepers and residents. The answers were always the same: a shrug, a vague, "She looks familiar," but no concrete information. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, and Arthur's frustration grew with each passing hour. He felt trapped, impotent, a billionaire whose vast financial resources seemed useless against the task of finding a single child. At home, the atmosphere was one of a fragile truce. Leo, sensing the shift in his father's attitude, had dropped his defensive posture. He saw his father on the phone, brow furrowed with worry, or pacing in his study, and understood that the game had far more serious implications. One evening, as Arthur stared blankly at a city map on his screen, Leo quietly approached and placed a drawing on the desk. It was a portrait of Clara, surprisingly detailed for a 7-year-old. She was smiling, and next to her was a woman with the same smile. "That's her mom, Sophia," Leo said, his voice low. "Clara said her mom knew you, said you were good to her once, a long time ago." The information landed like a stone in a calm pond, creating ripples of memory. Sophia. The name was familiar, but he couldn't place a face to it. He dealt with hundreds of people, employees, partners, clients. Who could she be? He searched his mental files, his business records, but nothing fit. Good to her once. It was too vague. A former employee? The daughter of an old associate? The question hung in the air, adding another layer of mystery to the puzzle. Meanwhile, news of the foiled kidnapping plot spread. Arthur's name was kept out of the press by the FBI to protect his privacy, but in the closed circle of the ultra-wealthy, rumors were flying. He was the target who had escaped, the lucky one, but he knew it wasn't luck. It was Clara's intervention. On the third day, Harris finally called with a lead. "Sir, we found something. Not the girl, but the mother. One of our sources recognized the description. Sophia Reyes. She worked as a temp cleaner in one of our commercial buildings about 5 years ago. Let go after a few weeks. The address we have on file is old, but it's in the same neighborhood where the girl disappeared. It's a start." Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline. Finally, a connection, a thread to pull. He vaguely recalled a hardship fund his company had maintained at the time, offering small financial grants to employees in distress. Maybe that was it. Maybe the goodness Leo spoke of was just a standard HR procedure, something he hadn't even personally approved. He took the address and decided to go himself, against Harris's advice. He needed answers, and he felt he wouldn't get them by sending his men. He drove to the neighborhood, the streets growing narrower and the buildings more worn with each block. The address led him to a modest apartment building with peeling paint and clotheslines strung from the windows. No doorman or security cameras here, just life, raw and unfiltered. He climbed the worn stairs to the third floor, his heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He found apartment 4B and knocked. After a moment, the door opened a crack, held by a security chain. A frightened eye peered through the gap. It was a woman, her face pale and etched with worry. The face of the woman in Leo's drawing, Sophia. "Mr. Sterling?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What are you doing here? They can't see you here. It's dangerous." Before Arthur could reply, the door slammed shut. He heard the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place and hurried footsteps retreating. He was inches away from the answers he sought. But a new barrier had been thrown up. The fear on Sophia's face was palpable, terrifying, and it confirmed Arthur's worst nightmare. The criminals knew. They knew it was Clara who had ruined their plans. And now she and her family were being hunted. The door, slammed in his face, was more eloquent than any words. The raw fear in Sophia's eyes, the panic in her voice. Arthur took a step back, the adrenaline of the chase replaced by a cold recognition of imminent danger. He was no longer just trying to understand the past. He had collided with a terrifying present. To stand there, to insist, would only put that family in more danger. He descended the stairs quickly, his mind working at high speed. Sophia's reaction wasn't that of someone trying to avoid a past benefactor. It was the reaction of someone being watched, terrorized. He scanned the street below, the parked cars, the windows of neighboring buildings, with a new paranoia. Who were they? And how close were they? Back in his car, a sense of urgency consumed him. He couldn't just drive away. Leaving Sophia and Clara at the mercy of criminals he had indirectly set upon them was unthinkable. The promise he had made to Helena to be a better man echoed in his conscience. Being a better man wasn't just about spending more time with his son, it was about taking responsibility, and this, he felt, was his responsibility. He reached for his phone, ready to call Harris and order a discreet security team to monitor the building, but something stopped him. What if they were already watching? A security team, no matter how discreet, could be noticed and interpreted as a threat, precipitating a violent response. He needed a different, more subtle approach. He called a contact he hadn't used in years, a private investigator named Donovan, a man who operated in the shadows, specializing in delicate situations that couldn't be handled through official channels. Arthur explained the situation in vague but urgent terms. I need eyes on a place. Donovan? Invisible. I want to know who comes in, who goes out, who lingers on the corner too long. And I need a way to communicate with the residents of a specific apartment without anyone noticing. Donovan, a man of few words, simply replied, "Give me the address. Consider it done." While he waited, Arthur circled the neighborhood from a safe distance, his head throbbing with tension. The image of the girl, Clara, holding his son and crying on his doorstep, was superimposed with the image of fear on her mother's face. The child's courage haunted him. She had risked everything for him. Now, it was his turn. Hours later, Donovan called back. "You were right. There's a black sedan with tinted windows parked at the end of the street. Been there for 2 days. Ghost plates. 2 men inside, taking shifts. They're not being subtle. It's clear intimidation." The confirmation made Arthur's stomach churn. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. "And the communication?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "There's an elderly woman living in the next-door apartment, a Mrs. Gable. She's an old client, reliable. She'll make contact." "What should I have her tell them?" Arthur thought for a moment. He needed to gain Sophia's trust, to show her he understood the danger and was there to help, not to complicate things. Tell her to slip a note under Sophia's door. The note should say only one thing: "I know. Meet me at the old carousel in the municipal park at dusk. Alone. He won't be there, but a friend will be." He chose the location purposefully. It was a public place, but one that was mostly deserted at night, and the still, silent carousel was an unmistakable landmark, a place from childhood, one he hoped would convey a sense of safety. At dusk, Arthur was hidden in his car, parked a block from the park, watching through a small pair of binoculars. Donovan was positioned at another vantage point, both connected by a discreet earpiece. He saw a small, hesitant figure approach the carousel. It was Sophia. She looked all around, her body tense, ready to run at the slightest sign of trouble. Then Donovan, dressed as a simple park maintenance worker, approached her calmly. Arthur couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see Sophia's body language change. Tension gave way to hesitation, and then to a reluctant nod. Donovan walked away and spoke into his comms. "She told me everything. They found her the day after the incident, threatened the girl. She couldn't go to the police. They said they had people on the inside. She's terrified, but there's something else, Arthur. Something that changes everything." Arthur waited, his heart in his throat. The hit-and-run story. It wasn't the girl's idea, it was the mother's. Sophia orchestrated the whole thing. Donovan's revelation struck Arthur like a bolt from the blue. Sophia, the mastermind, the image of the terrified, helpless mother shattered, replaced by a far more complex one, a desperate strategist, a woman who had used her own daughter as the centerpiece in a high-stakes play. The admiration he felt for Clara's courage now extended, with a new and bewildering intensity, to her mother. What kind of desperation would drive a mother to put her child in such a vulnerable position, to teach her to lie so convincingly, and to send her to the door of a powerful, unpredictable man? He needed to understand why. The motivation behind such an extreme act was the missing key to the entire mystery, Donovan continued, his voice low and urgent in the earpiece. "She said she found out about the plot by accident, Arthur. She does cleaning gigs at several corporate offices. One of them belonged to one of the men you saw getting arrested. She was cleaning late one night, overheard a conversation she wasn't supposed to, heard your name, the date, the location, realized it was a setup. She didn't know what to do. Going to the cops was a risk. They mentioned having contacts on the force, trying to warn you directly. Who would believe a cleaning lady's word against influential businessmen? She figured you'd dismiss her as crazy." Donovan's words painted a vivid picture of Sophia's dilemma. Trapped between inaction and danger, she had chosen a third path, an act of desperate theater, the only weapon she possessed. She had gambled everything on the only connection she had to him, a vague memory of an act of kindness, the hope that a father's love for his son could override any business logic. She needs to get out of there, Donovan, her and the girl. Now, Arthur said, the decision forming instantly. The danger was real and immediate. The men in the car weren't there to watch. They were waiting for an opportunity, or perhaps an order. Bring them to one of my safe apartments. The one in the Atlantic building. No one knows about that place. Use a service vehicle. Leave through their building's back garage. Create a distraction out front if you have to. He was no longer just trying to help. He was taking control of the situation, using his wealth and resources not to accumulate more capital, but to preserve lives. For the first time in years, he felt his assets were being used for something that truly mattered, something Helena would have approved of. The operation was executed with the precision of a business plan. While one of Donovan's men created a small commotion on the street, a car alarm that wouldn't shut off, Donovan guided a frightened Sophia and Clara through a rear service exit and into a nondescript vehicle. Arthur watched from a distance until he received confirmation they were safe and on their way. Only then did he drive to the apartment. An anonymous luxury safe haven overlooking the city, one of his many rarely used assets. When he arrived, he found them in the living room. Clara, upon seeing him, darted behind her mother, her eyes wide and apprehensive. Sophia was pale, but her posture held a defiant dignity. She faced him, shame and fear mingling in her gaze. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do. I owed you. Years ago, my mother was very sick. I was working at your company. You wouldn't remember, but our insurance didn't cover everything. You paid the difference out of your own pocket. You saved her life. I never forgot that." The memory hit him. An employee crying in his office. A story about medical bills. He had signed a check, a meaningless amount to him, a casual act of philanthropy to soothe his conscience. He never thought of it again. But for Sophia, that gesture had created a debt of gratitude so profound, she was willing to risk everything to repay it. He looked at the woman before him, at the little girl hiding behind her, and the complexity of their actions struck him. It was a tangle of fear, loyalty, and a courage he could barely comprehend. But now, a new and formidable obstacle stood before them: how to protect two people targeted by a criminal organization when the police themselves couldn't be trusted. The security of the luxury apartment was a stark contrast to the fear that hung in the air. Clara, initially shy, slowly began to relax, fascinated by the panoramic city view and the comforts she had never known. For her, it was an adventure. For Arthur and Sophia, it was a gilded cage. Their conversation flowed in bursts of revelation and tense silence. Sophia explained how she had concocted the plan, using Clara's playground interactions with Leo to build a bond of trust between the children. She had coached her daughter on what to say, what to do, rehearsing the scene dozens of times, her heart aching with the weight of the lie she was forcing her to tell. Arthur listened, his admiration for her ingenuity warring with his unease at the manipulation of his son. That manipulation, he would soon discover, had created an unexpected and painful obstacle. The next day, he brought Leo to the apartment, believing the presence of his friend would comfort him. The reaction was the opposite of what he expected. Upon seeing Clara, Leo didn't smile. He crossed his arms, his face set in a scowl. "You lied to me," he said, his voice thick with a child's deep sense of betrayal. "You made me lie to my dad. You used me." Clara shrank back, her eyes filling with tears. "It was to protect him, Leo. My mom said bad men were going to get your dad, but the logic of a wounded child doesn't bend to complex explanations." For Leo, their friendship had been a tool, and he felt like a discarded toy. "I don't want to play with you anymore. I want to go home," he declared, turning his back on both her and his father. Leo's rebellion was a blow to Arthur. He was trying to build a fortress to protect Clara and Sophia. But the foundation of that fortress, the cooperation of his own son, was cracking. How could he explain the gravity of the situation to Leo without terrifying him? How could he make him understand that Clara's lie, while wrong in its method, came from a place of courage and loyalty? Leo's refusal to cooperate wasn't just an emotional problem, it was a security risk. In his anger or naivete, he might say something at school, to friends, and any misplaced word could reach the wrong ears. Their protection depended on absolute secrecy. While Arthur dealt with the domestic crisis, Donovan brought disturbing news from the outside world. They're looking for them, Arthur, aggressively. They're showing photos around the old apartment building, offering cash for information. This isn't just intimidation anymore, they're hunting. The threat was escalating, the net tightening. The safe apartment, which once seemed impenetrable, now felt fragile, and the official police investigation into the kidnapping ring had stalled suspiciously. The initial arrests seemed to be the end of it, with no move to go after the masterminds. Sophia's suspicion about corrupt cops was gaining terrifying weight. One afternoon, Donovan called with an update that made Arthur's blood run cold. "I have terrible news. One of the lead detectives on the case, a Detective Burke, was seen having lunch with a man my contacts identify as the right-hand man of one of the executives you saw being arrested. They're trading information. The police aren't just stalled, they're actively leaking to the criminals." The revelation confirmed the worst-case scenario. They had no one to turn to. Any attempt to use legal channels to protect Clara and Sophia would be the same as delivering them directly to their pursuers. They were alone, trapped in a web of corruption that stretched from the city's dark alleys to the halls of justice. The challenge was no longer just hiding Sophia and Clara, but finding a way to fight back against an enemy who had eyes and ears everywhere, including inside the police force itself. The news of police corruption fell like a sentence upon the isolated group in the apartment. Any hope that the situation could be resolved by the authorities evaporated, leaving behind a bitter residue of fear and helplessness. They were no longer just fugitives, they were targets in a game whose rules were dictated by their enemies. Arthur felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. Every decision he made, every plan he formulated, now carried the burden of 4 lives, his own, his son's, and those of Sophia and Clara, to whom he had made a silent promise of protection. His business instincts screamed at him to cut his losses, to find a way to get Sophia and Clara out of the country, to move the problem far away. But as he looked at Leo's face, still sullen in the corner of the room, and at Clara, who was trying bravely to smile for her mother, he knew he couldn't. This wasn't a business deal. This was about people. It was about the promise he had made to Helena. The dynamic in the apartment became a microcosm of the tension surrounding them. Sophia, though grateful for the safety, felt like a prisoner, her life and her daughter's now dependent on the benevolence of a man she barely knew. She spent hours staring out the window, not at the stunning view, but at the cars and people below, searching for signs of danger. Meanwhile, Leo's hostility toward Clara created a fissure in the fragile sanctuary they were trying to build. He refused to join in games, answered in monosyllables, and looked at her with a silent accusation that hurt the girl more than any words. Arthur tried to mediate, to explain the situation in terms a 7-year-old could grasp. "Leo, imagine a big, mean dog was about to bite me, and Clara, to save me, threw your favorite toy in front of the dog to distract it. Would you be mad about the toy, or happy that she saved me?" Leo considered it for a moment, the analogy seeming to make some sense. But the wound of being used was still raw. "But she didn't have to lie," he insisted. It was during one of these tense conversations that a flashback hit Arthur with unexpected clarity. He remembered a night, about a year before Helena's death. He was in his study late, poring over spreadsheets for a risky crypto investment. Helena had come in, her face pale with worry. "Arthur, I heard something at the club today about your new partner, Ricardo. They were saying he has dangerous connections, that he isn't who he seems to be." Arthur, immersed in projections of astronomical profits, had dismissed her concern as gossip. "Helena, please. This is the business world. Everyone has skeletons in their closet. What matters is the return he brings on our capital." She had persisted, her eyes pleading with him to listen. "It's not about the money, Arthur. It's about safety. About our family." He had cut her off impatiently, telling her she didn't understand these things. The memory filled him with a crushing guilt. Helena had warned him. She had seen something his greed had blinded him to. The memory galvanized him. Ricardo, his closest partner, the man he had brought into his most intimate business circle, who had access to his entire life, his schedule, his plans. Could it be? The idea was so monstrous, so treacherous, that his mind initially rejected it. Ricardo was his friend, the champion of his boldest investments, but suspicion, once planted, grew like a weed. He asked Donovan to investigate Ricardo, discreetly but thoroughly. "I want everything, Donovan. His financials, his calls, his meetings. Start with his relationship to Detective Burke and the other men who were arrested." The hunt for a faceless enemy suddenly had a focus, a name. And if his suspicions were correct, the danger wasn't just outside the apartment walls. It was inside his company, in his boardroom, smiling at him over business dinners. The enemy had the key to his life, and he had never seen him coming. The investigation into Ricardo consumed Arthur. He began to operate on two levels. By day, he maintained a facade of business as usual, participating in conference calls and answering emails, always aware that his every word could be monitored. By night, in the safe apartment, he and Donovan pieced together a dark puzzle from the information the investigator gathered. The pieces began to fit with alarming speed, forming a picture of betrayal so profound it made Arthur's stomach turn. Donovan uncovered hidden financial transfers, routed through a complex web of offshore accounts and Bitcoin wallets, linking Ricardo not only to Detective Burke, but to the mastermind of the entire kidnapping operation. The plan had never been about ransom. The goal was Arthur's disappearance, allowing Ricardo, through contractual clauses Arthur had signed without due diligence, to assume total control of his assets and his empire. The billion-dollar investment meeting was the final stage, and Arthur was the lead actor in a tragedy he didn't even know he was starring in. Helena had been right, and he had ignored her. Inside the apartment, the tension between the children began to thaw, slowly and unexpectedly. One afternoon, while Arthur was engrossed in a report from Donovan, he heard a soft crying from the other room. It was Clara. He went in to find her sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. "I miss my home," she whispered. "Even if it was small, it was our home. I miss my toys." At that moment, Leo, who had been standing in the doorway, walked into the room. He was silent for a moment, watching her. Then, without a word, he went to his backpack, took out his favorite superhero action figure, the very one he had refused to share for days, and held it out to Clara. "You can hold him for a while," he mumbled, not looking her in the eye. "He's really good at protecting people." Clara looked up, her tears stopping. She took the action figure, and a small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world. Leo finally understood. The protection was more important than the toy, more important than the lie. He was beginning to see Clara not as the girl who tricked him, but as the hero who saved his father. This small truce, however, was brutally shattered. Donovan called, his voice stripped of its usual calm, replaced by a chilling urgency. "Arthur, they have her, not Sophia, the girl, Clara." Arthur's world stopped. "How? Where?" Sophia needed a specific medication. The pharmacy in the building was out. She made a mistake. Arthur. She went down to a pharmacy 2 blocks away, thought it would be quick, that no one would recognize her. She left Clara sleeping, but they were waiting. They didn't follow her. They went into the apartment as soon as she left. The night doorman was overpowered. They took the girl. They left a message. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. What message, Donovan? They want you, Arthur. And they want something Sophia took from their boss's office, something she didn't know she had. A small digital voice recorder that was mixed in with her cleaning supplies. They want it, and they want you. In exchange for the girl, you have 24 hours. Panic hit him full force, but underneath it, a cold fury began to form. They had crossed the line. They had taken a child. Sophia, on the phone with Donovan, was in a state of shock, her uncontrollable sobs of guilt and terror echoing down the line. Arthur took a deep breath, forcing his mind to work through the chaos. He looked at Leo, who had overheard the conversation, his face pale with fear, clutching his other superhero figure, protect his son, save Clara. The 2 priorities collided in his mind. To give himself up meant leaving Leo an orphan. To refuse meant condemning Clara. Was there a third option? He had to create one. He remembered the recorder. Sophia, between sobs, confirmed she had found it in her cleaning bag and, not knowing what it was, had stored it in a box of trinkets. It was the only piece of leverage they had. But was it enough? And how could he use it without walking into their trap? The clock was ticking, and the weight of an impossible choice rested entirely on his shoulders. The 24 hours began to slip through Arthur's fingers like sand. The apartment, once a refuge, had become a claustrophobic war room. Sophia, devastated by guilt, could barely speak, her eyes fixed on an empty spot on the wall, replaying her fatal mistake. Leo, in contrast, was strangely quiet, the fear in his eyes replaced by a grim determination Arthur had never seen before. It was Leo who broke the paralyzing silence. "Dad," he said, his voice firm, "we have to save her, like the superhero does." His son's simple words cut through Arthur's fog of panic, focusing his mind. He couldn't give in to despair. He needed a plan, one as bold and unexpected as Sophia's had been. A bitter irony, he thought. He would have to use a charade to save the victim of another charade. He focused on the one advantage they had, the digital recorder. Donovan managed to retrieve it from Sophia's old apartment, and together they listened to the contents. The quality was poor, muffled, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Ricardo, discussing the final details of Arthur's kidnapping with Detective Burke, mentioning payments, escape routes, and, most damning of all, the explicit order that Arthur was not to survive captivity. It was the proof they needed, the silver bullet that could bring down the entire scheme. But to hand it over as demanded was to give up their only copy and himself. They had to use it differently. "Donovan, find me the most honest cop you know. Someone Burke can't touch. Someone outside his jurisdiction, maybe from internal affairs. We'll need him, but only at the last minute," Arthur instructed, the strategy beginning to form in his mind. "Sophia, I'm going to need you. I need you to be strong." He then turned to Leo. "Son, I'm going to ask you to do the hardest thing I've ever asked. You're going to have to be brave, braver than any superhero." The plan was risky, bordering on insane. He would use the very tactic that had put him in this situation. He would echo Clara's original ploy. Arthur contacted the kidnappers through the number they had provided. His voice was controlled, cold. "I'll turn myself in and I'll bring the recording. But I have one condition. I want proof the girl is all right, and I want the exchange made in a public place. The old abandoned textile mill near the docks, at noon. If I see any sign of a trap, the recording is automatically sent to every news outlet in the country." The criminals, led by Ricardo's voice in the background, agreed, their arrogance evident. They thought they had won. The next morning, The air was thick with an almost unbearable tension. Donovan positioned discreet snipers on the buildings surrounding the mill. The contact from Internal Affairs, a man named Lieutenant Morales, was on standby with a trusted team, waiting for the signal. Arthur wore a bulletproof vest under his shirt, its weight a constant reminder of the danger, but the hardest part of the plan was yet to come. He knelt in front of Leo. "Son, Donovan is going to take you. You'll go in through the back of the mill with him. They won't see you. When I give the signal, I want you to scream. Scream as loud as you can. Scream for me." Leo looked at him, his eyes wide, but he nodded. The child who had felt used by a lie was now a willing part of a performance to save a life. At noon, Arthur walked alone toward the mill. Ricardo and two thugs were waiting, Clara beside them, her face pale but defiant. "Where's the recording, Arthur?" Ricardo sneered. Arthur held up the small device. "The girl first." One of the thugs pushed Clara toward him. The moment Arthur's hands touched her shoulder, he yelled the signal, "Now!" Instantly, from the back of the mill, Leo's terrified scream echoed, "Dad, help me!" The sound hit Ricardo like an electric shock. His head snapped in the direction of the cry, confusion and panic on his face. He never expected Arthur's son to be there. His attention was diverted for a single, fatal second. It was all Arthur needed. He shoved Clara behind him and lunged at Ricardo, not as a businessman, but as a father protecting his young. In that instant, the windows of the mill shattered. Chaos erupted. The chaos was instant and overwhelming. The sound of Leo's scream, followed by the shattering of windows, triggered a synchronized operation. Lieutenant Morales' team stormed the location from multiple entrances, the sound of their heavy boots and shouted commands echoing through the abandoned warehouse. Ricardo's thugs, caught completely off guard by the police presence and the tactical distraction, hesitated. That hesitation cost them their freedom. Within seconds, they were subdued and handcuffed. Arthur, acting on pure instinct, used the moment of confusion to tackle Ricardo to the ground. The struggle was brief and clumsy, a clash of two men in suits amidst dust and debris. But Arthur's righteous fury prevailed. He held his former partner and friend against the cold concrete until a police officer's hands took over, cuffing Ricardo's wrists behind his back. Once the threat was neutralized, Arthur rushed to Clara, wrapping her in a protective embrace. "It's over, you're safe," he whispered, relief making his voice tremble. Soon after, Donovan emerged with Leo, who ran into his father's arms. The embrace of the three of them, in the center of that chaotic scene, was the true end of the conflict. Leo looked over his father's shoulder at Clara. "Did I scream loud enough?" he asked, seeking approval. Clara, still shaking, managed to smile. "You were the best superhero." The animosity between them had been washed away by shared danger and mutual courage. In the days that followed, the dust began to settle, revealing both losses and victories. The recording, along with Arthur's testimony and the evidence Donovan had gathered, was more than enough to dismantle the entire network. Ricardo, Detective Burke, and dozens of others were indicted. The victory in court was absolute. However, the cost to Arthur was immense. The investigation into Ricardo inevitably exposed the underbelly of his company, revealing questionable financial practices and a culture of risk that he himself had fostered. To save what was left of the company and protect his innocent employees, he was forced to sell his majority stake for a fraction of its original value. The vast fortune he had spent a lifetime building, the millions in stocks, the net worth that had defined his identity, it was all gone. He was no longer a billionaire. The loss, which once would have been his annihilation, now felt secondary. His greatest victory wasn't in the courtroom or on a balance sheet. It was in his own home. One evening, as he was setting the table for dinner, something the housekeeper had always done, Leo came over and helped him place the plates. "Dad," the boy said, his tone serious, "I was really scared. But I was happy you were there to save Clara, and not at your meeting." The words hit Arthur harder than the loss of any amount of money. His son didn't care about the dollars, the assets, or the gold. He cared about presence. He cared that his father had chosen people over profit. In that moment, Arthur felt that although he had lost his empire, he had finally begun to fulfill the promise he made to Helena. He was becoming the father Leo needed, the man she had always wanted him to be. He had traded his wealth for something infinitely more valuable, his son's admiration and peace in his own soul. The rebuilding of his life was just beginning, but for the first time, he felt he was building on a solid foundation of truth and love. 3 weeks after that fateful morning, Arthur Sterling's mansion no longer echoed with the silence of loneliness. The sound of children's laughter now filled the marble halls, bouncing off walls that had once only held the ticking of expensive clocks. The grand dining table, the stage for so many solitary meals, was now the center of a new, unlikely family. Arthur, Leo, Sophia, and Clara sat together, sharing not just food, but the day's stories, the small triumphs and trivial worries that make up the texture of a real life. Formality had given way to a comfortable mess, and Arthur had never felt richer. The loss of his colossal fortune turned out to be his liberation. Freed from the relentless pressure of managing a vast and complex portfolio of assets, he rediscovered time to take Leo to school, to help with his homework, to listen to his stories about superheroes and dinosaurs. Time to talk with Sophia, a woman of admirable strength and resilience whose practical intelligence and unshakable loyalty inspired him daily. He had offered her and Clara a lifetime of security, but Sophia, with her dignity intact, refused charity. Instead, she accepted a partnership. Together, they started a new business, a small but innovative security consulting firm focused on protecting families, not corporations, built on a foundation of ethics and transparency. Sophia, with her unique perspective on vulnerabilities, became an invaluable partner. Her family was no longer a beneficiary of his old inheritance. They were co-builders of his new future. One sunny afternoon, Arthur stood in the backyard, watching Leo and Clara play near an old swing set. They were no longer just friends. They were battle-forged siblings, accomplices in an adventure that had bound them together forever. He thought about how it had all begun, with a desperate knock on the door and a lie born of fear and courage. The girl who had faked an emergency to prevent a real tragedy had become the guardian angel who saved him not just from kidnappers, but from himself. She had shown him that sometimes small lies are necessary to protect greater, more important truths. The son, who had felt used as a pawn in a charade, had learned the profound difference between manipulation and sacrifice, discovering that the truest heroes are those willing to risk everything to protect the ones they love. Helena would have loved this. He could almost feel her presence in the gentle breeze that stirred the leaves, her approving smile in the warmth of the sun. He finally understood what she had tried to tell him for all those years. True wealth wasn't stored in vaults or traded on the stock market. It wasn't measured in Bitcoin, dollars, or the return on investments. The greatest asset a man could ever have was the love, loyalty, and courage of the people around him. The tycoon, who almost lost everything to greed, had discovered that real fortune lay in the bravery of a child and the gratitude of a mother. The mansion that had nearly witnessed a tragedy had finally become a home, the place where 3 broken families had come together to learn that true strength has no price tag, and that saving someone's soul sometimes means being willing to lose everything else.